Hi everyone, we're going to join Tim Krepp.
Good morning. My name is Tim Krepp, and I'm a docent here at Congressional Cemetery. I'm going to go ahead and take this off because I'm pretty much alone. I'm right now in the chapel of Congressional Cemetery. I want to thank you for joining us here on our first ever virtual tour of the cemetery. We're going to be doing this every Saturday at 11 o'clock for, well, now until the things change. And different docents will be doing it every week, so I encourage you to jump back in week after week and to see how different docents approach the same cemetery. Obviously, everything I tell you will be true, and their stories will be variations of my truths, but it's always a lot of fun to see some of these things from different perspectives, and we're going to go explore different things. We're going to go anywhere for about 45 minutes to an hour today. We're going to see some of the more notable graves here at the cemetery, as well as a little discussion of how the cemetery grew and where it came from. But I want to begin with just a little bit of the layout here. If you're watching here on Facebook Live, you are able to ask questions during the chat, and as we go from place to place, we'll pause for a little bit and take a look at some of those questions. And so if you have them, feel free to enter those questions via chat, and we'll try to take as many as possible and go from there. To start off with the chapel here, so a little bit of background on the cemetery itself. You have a Wikipedia page, open up a little browser, you can read about a lot more history on that kind of stuff about the cemetery itself. But it was started in 1803. It was started, 1807. It was started as the burial ground for Christ Church Episcopal Church, which is just down that road, about 10 blocks or so. And we were on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. at the time, or well on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. So this is simply a convenient place to bury the dead for that parish. But then Congress started meeting right around that same time, and Congress meeting comprised of a bunch of old dudes, doing what old dudes do, and they died. And as things went along, they needed a convenient burial spot for Congress members that passed away. So we have no real formal affiliation with Congress, other than we have to be the final resting place of quite a few congressmen that were buried here. We'll talk more about that as we go outside and see some of the graves. But this was always a neighborhood, a city, a local burial place, first and foremost, that happens to have some folks of national importance, and we continue that to this day. Let me talk a little about where I'm at right now, which is the chapel. This was built around the turn of the century. We're going to just do a little scope around here while I keep talking. This was done around the turn. Used in Britain, but in 1895, and I kid you not, in Balmer's Monthly had a contest to see what a new name would this, because undertaking had too much of a grim tone to it. And they came across the term mortician. So in the United States, we use the term mortician. But this is part of the post-Civil War professionalization of funeral services. We changed how we interact with the dead. Previously, say 1840s, 30s, 40s, like that, if you passed away, you were laid out in the front parlor. And the front parlor of the room of the house was a room that transcended both the public and the private spheres. And it was a room that was used only maybe for a Sunday gathering of relatives, marriages, and of course funerals. And you'd be laid out at home. You'd be taken there. Generally, members of the family would take care of the body. The only professional element of that would be the cabinet maker. And if you look at 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, advertisements for cabinet makers and furniture makers, you would often see them say that they would be available on short notice, which is a euphemism for we'll make you coffee for you real quick and have it die. The Civil War changes all that. The Civil War and Lincoln's funeral makes this process professional. And now you start hiring someone, a funeral director, eventually a permanent mortician. And our cemetery, like other places, wanted to get done. It was quite lucrative. It was a good way to raise a few money to be able to host this place. We didn't want to have the body laid out in the front living room. They wanted some sort of other space to go to do that. And that's what this chapel was built for. And you can see these doors right here. There's 3 on this side here, and we'll see the outside as well, and 3 on the other side there. And they were designed to house caskets, coffins. And you have 5, 6, 7 funerals a day during the influenza epidemic of 1919, which is always getting a lot of press today. They were scattered outside. But you have the services. You have everyone in the seats out there. You're going to open the casket, which is now used for storage. There's rollers right here. They roll the casket out. You have the services. Everyone can walk to the grave all night behind it, and it was handled quite well. We're going to take a little pause on that. We're going to walk out outside and talk a little bit more about what we're seeing on the outside of the cemetery.
Sounds good.
So as we're heading outside, if you were to continue on straight on outside, you can see down in the distance is John Philip Sousa's grave over to the left. There's a truck parked over there. Not sure why.
Adopt a plot.
Oh, adopt a plot. Yeah, yes. Oh, yes. So that's a good time. We have an adopt a plot program, which is what that truck is doing over that way. And the idea of that is that a lot of the graves over here are held by family members who have moved away or no longer present. So we have a program where we adopt a plot, where people can come in, they can take this plot as theirs, and they can garden, they can plant things, non-edible fruit or plants, please. But this gives folks that live in tight urban spaces that want to garden someplace that they can do that. And this is a good way to show how our cemetery still fills the role of a community gathering space, as well as simply a place to dump the dead. And this goes back to Victorian times, when back into going back to the 1800s, early 1800s or so, cemeteries were social gathering spots. That progressively grew. There was a whole movement towards where folks would picnic at cemeteries, would bring the kids there, they'd run the dogs along there. And in better times, when we're not closed with pandemics, we still adhere to that, where we have quite a few events. So check out our calendar. There are, or will be, when this all clears, quite a few public events that we love to do here. We can gather folks when it's safe to do so again. We have 5Ks here for those people that like to run, obviously not me. But we have the Soul Strolls in the fall, which is where some of us dress up as residents of the cemetery and we show people around. So there's a lot of fun things we do there, in keeping with that ethos of a cemetery as a public gathering spot, which we like to continue to do so. Anyway, we're not going to see John Philip Sousa. You're going to have to turn in next week for another docent to come see that. But we are going to come down this way towards the main gatehouse. If you come over this way a little bit here, we're going to come on over this way, and you're going to see, if you just scan over that way, you can see, I'd like to point out a couple things from this angle right here. One is that this is kind of rolling hillsides with rolling grasslands. And this is the only real spot, or one of the only real spots within the L'Enfant plan, the original plan of Washington, D.C., where you can get a good sense of what the topography of the federal city of Washington was like. The rolling hills, the rolling grass, like everywhere else has been urbanized. They've leveled out the streets, they've created flat lands. You don't want to have this kind of rolling stuff when you're trying to create a flat cityscape. So it's all been filled in low spots, cut off the high spots, all that. But you get a little sense of that. And as we walk around, keep that in mind of the acreage here at Congressional. You get to see some of that topography. So let's come over here a little bit here, and we can see a little bit of what we're talking about, the congressional aspect of the cemetery. When you look at these called cenotaphs, they are not tombs. They are not grave sites. Well, I should back up a little bit. Some of them are grave sites, some of them are not. Now, you real history nerds on there, you can see this is Henry Clay's cenotaph. And as you probably may know, Henry Clay is not buried here in Washington, D.C. He is buried here back in Kentucky, where he's from. The idea of these cenotaphs is that they were markers created by Congress. When a congressman passed away while in office, they would get one of these cenotaphs. They were designed by William Thornton, who is also buried here. We'll see his grave later on. And they were designed to just mark the end of time. So before Arlington Cemetery, before that became more a formal place, Congressional Cemetery was referred to as the Westminster Abbey of America, the place where insofar as we had a national cemetery, this was it up until the Civil War. So folks like Henry Clay and Calhoun that died in office would get a marker here. And you'll see some of these names you recognize when you go down the way there a little bit. In fact, let's walk down the way a little bit here, and we can just see some of the names that we're looking at as we go along. So Clay, Calhoun is buried in South Carolina where he belongs. Thank goodness. And you'll see some of these other names here. Again, some of these folks are buried here, some of these names are buried here, but most of them are back home with the families. which again, going back to funeral rites, going back to how we interacted with the dead pre-Civil War time periods, more often than not, when you passed away, you were simply buried wherever you died. It was incredibly expensive and rare to move a body. There was obvious logistical challenges with it. In fact, there was a railway strike in 1898, a little bit later than we're talking to, where one of the conditions of the railway porters that were walking that, they wouldn't go back to work until the remains were actually properly embalmed anymore, because not to be overly gross, those that weren't embalmed were a shipping challenge for the porters, so they got quite understandably so at that. So until embalming as a science came around, Civil War and afterwards, until refrigerated rail cars, until and railroads in general came around, steamships, bodies were generally buried where you died, and maybe for obvious reasons years later you might be reinterred and moved to there. We had some of those folks as well. Let me pause for just a second here. Let's turn to the more modern sections here. We have a plethora of fascinating graves. Again, that's going to be another tour if you want to come back on this section over here. But we're having a lot of more modern, the cemetery's had a revival in the last 10 years as neighborhood interest has grown, as other problems come around. Elaine Locke over there was recently buried here. He was the first African-American Rhodes Scholar. He passed away. Tragically, his remains were kind of forgotten for a while. We're sitting on a shelf somewhere, cremated remains. So we're very proud to have him here and able to provide a final resting place. And you can see all the way down there, my absolute favorite one. If you look down just a little bit here, we're not going to go all the way down there, is, actually we're not going to go down there. Why don't I just, is Ruth Ann Overbeck. And those of us that live on Capitol Hill are familiar with the Overbeck Lecture Series, which is a monthly series of historical notes given by the Capitol Historical Society, named after Miss Overbeck. She passed away fairly young, tragically, from cancer. She was a historian, and she may be my actual most favorite grave here, but we can see her marker. Hopefully we'll see it with the sun today. Not this plot, but right over here you have, instead of a date, Miss Overbeck has simply Ruth Ann Overbeck. Look it up. Go do your own research. Don't rely upon others to provide your source. So I, as a pseudo historian myself, I quite love that a little bit. So let's take a walk through the cemetery, and we're going to see some of the folks that are of particular note. Through, we're gonna keep on here. You can see that sometimes it's in good shape today. We still have some damaged tombstones. That's to be expected over 200 some years of wear and tear. The crypts that we have, and again, you have to come back for another tour to talk more about the crypts. They've largely all been restored. We've had a little bit of cracking here and there, but for many years they were in very rough shape. But they've all been inventoried. We work with the Smithsonian to go through the remains, make sure they're the proper caskets and redone. We can learn a lot from them. Recoded and recovered and all that. So we've had a lot of effort in the last decade, 2 decades, of bringing the cemetery back to a working cemetery. It had fallen into quite a bit of disrepair over the years. So it's a work in progress, but there's been a lot done so far. It continues to be done, even with the pandemic. And I should note, this is not the cemetery's first pandemic. We played quite a role in the influenza epidemic in 1919. Also the cholera breakout, when cholera first came in the 1830s, 1837 or so, a lot of the folks on that hillside over there were buried in that first cholera epidemic, which was a terrifying time for Washington, D.C. as well. So this is old hat to us. We're going to all survive this, or most of us are going to survive this. And the cemetery is a good place to go explore a little of the past of those pandemics. Perhaps we'll do that in a future tour. The question, is it okay to walk through the cemetery? By all means, you encourage people to walk around the cemetery. You do want to be careful. You can see a lot of cracked things like that. You don't want to be sitting on the table. This has already been cracked and restored and repurposed, so you certainly want to be very gentle with the tombstones and stuff like that. But you're welcome to go explore. You can't learn the stories of these folks if you don't go out and explore and see that. And yes, you're walking on grave sites, but we're doing so in a way to learn more about these people, not simply trot upon the graves. going to visit perhaps the most famous unmarked grave here. I want to point out, if you go across these areas such as here, you'll see these markers here. It'll have a range number, it'll be see some sort of cryptic numbers that only really those of us at Brooklyn Cemetery understand, because they talk about the range and where the site location, and a W. That means these, actually I think this is upside down. M over there, whatever. The W there. So these would form a family plot. So you might have a family plot that might have 1 or 2 markers on here, might have a few folks, but would often have 10, 15, 20 remains that are buried in this family plot. So tragically, many of the people that are buried here are children. You have a high rate of mortality or folks like that. So not all those folks will necessarily get a tombstone. You might put, that weird, uncle that never really went anywhere in life. He lives in the attic, passes away. He may get buried here. A family friend, any number of these folks that you might not necessarily look forward to a headstone at that time. So these family plots were held by families over generations, would have graves year after year, but not all of them. In fact, very few of them in some of these places are actually marked specifically. We'll talk about that right over here. And I'm on the family plot right here. There are 4 markers here. We'll look at those in just a second here. But there's quite a few graves here. This is the Harold family plot. Old Mr. Harold down here. He was an artisan down in the Navy Yard, which is a major employer for this section of the city here. In fact, it was one of the largest employers in Washington, D.C. up to really the 1890s or so, and even past then, up until the 1960s, was the Naval Gun Foundry. So it produced a lot of equipment. And we're not Pittsburgh here in Washington, D.C., but insofar as we have heavy industry, a lot of it was done by the Navy. Down the river a little bit at the Navy Yard down there, and Harold was one of those folks. He worked, I believe, as a carpenter, but someone double check on me, look that one up. As a carpenter there, was a prosperous middle class kind of lifestyle. His house still exists. It's over on 8th Street, right down by the Navy Yard. You go down there. I believe there's a Quiznos 2 doors down. That's from a converted house, but if you look at that area over there, but he had several daughters and sons. One of his sons grew up here in Washington, D.C., was a fairly intelligent lad, but to an extent, quick-witted on a certain level, but lazy, ill-disciplined, kind of wasted away around life. The Civil War breaks out, and young Davy is trying to figure out what he wants to do with his life. He doesn't seem to be very concerned by it, frankly. It's probably certainly a Southern sympathizer, as were most of the folks that lived in this area in Washington, D.C. It was a border state, not a state, obviously, a border region, so there's a large division of folks there. But it seems the Harold family tended to drift towards the south as far as they cared. Davy certainly did, but not enough to actually do anything about it. He wasn't going to put his life on the line or anything along those lines. But Davy was over that way, and he fell into cahoots with John Wilkes Booth, who of course you all recognize, I should hope. If I tell you who John Wilkes Booth is, we've got a lot more problems in history around here. But he fell into this circle. John Wilkes Booth was obviously a fascinating character for a young man looking for direction. Obviously quite theatrical, he's an actor. And Booth has this complicated plan to kidnap President Lincoln, which may or may not have been attempted. He claims it was, but whatever. But obviously it goes nowhere. The war ends. Booth decides on the spur of the moment to assassinate President Lincoln. He does so. Davy's job at that time was to not kill President Lincoln, but to go with Lewis Powell, this 6'4" Floridian who had been a captured Confederate prisoner, who was wandering the streets and also following the suits. Now, Davy is bright, but not exactly robust or exactly daring. So Lewis Powell's job is to kill the Secretary of State, William Seward. Davy's job is to get him there. They do. Lewis Powell goes in, goes up to Secretary of State Seward's house. He ends up stabbing him numerous times. Seward will survive, but will be in rough shape the rest of his life. It'll take quite a while to recover from his stab wounds. Lewis Powell comes running out of the house, shrieking, "I'm mad, I'm mad." He drops his knife in the gutter or in the bushes nearby and runs streaking down to somewhere, perhaps even here at the cemetery, to hide for 3 days. Reappears 3 days later, dripping in dried mud and blood and just really kind of miserable, all stuff, is caught, and he will be hung for the theft. Meanwhile, our good friend Davy here has escaped over the river over that way, has teamed up with Lincoln, will manage to escape out into Maryland and then into Virginia, where he'll be caught with Booth. Where he'll be caught with Booth about 13 days later when he's captured. Booth is shot during the capture. Harold, again, not exactly willing to put his life on the line, is captured by the Union force, and he was brought back here with Powell and with the others, and he is hung down at what's now the Fort McNair. It's the southernmost tennis court, I believe, is the site he was actually hung there if you go to Fort McNair. And he is buried on what we call the Washington Arsenal at the time. About 5 years later, his sister, the Harold family, comes and says, you know, can we have his body back? The Army says, yeah, as long as you keep him low-key, don't make a fuss about it, whatever. So he is buried, actually right underneath his sister, and I'm literally standing on top of Davy Harold right about now. So he's buried, obviously not marked, but he's down there. We have records, we know he's in there. Excellent. All right, continue on. So if you look up this way a little bit here, you can see we're kind of in a low-lying area here, going up to a higher ground. And you see there's kind of sparse amounts of grave in this area. This is because it's drainage issues, because real estate matters even when you're dead. If you could afford it, you want to be up the high ground because you're not down in the swampy low-lying areas, the more marshy areas. So it mattered quite a bit even back then. So we'll see more cenotaphs up this way, just like that last batch that we saw. There's one in particular I want to point out here. That's that stuff by itself underneath the big old holly tree. And this cenotaph is actually not for a congressman. It's one of the few not for a congressman around here. This is for William Thornton. William Thornton is the very first architect of the Capitol. And the more charitable histories you'll read about the Capitol will say, William Thornton wasn't really an architect. He was an Enlightenment gentleman, dabbled in a lot of different fields. He was really a surgeon. He was really a doctor at the time. So he dabbled in the architecture, but his main focus was the medicine of the times. And so after he kind of went away as architect of the Capitol, Benjamin Latrobe, a professionally trained British architect, came in to build the Capitol as we know it, or at least as 1832 as we know it. And that's, of course, accurate as far as it goes, but I have a little doubt as his qualities as a surgeon, as a doctor as well. He was close friends with George Washington. They had lived together, they interacted with each other over the years. And that's part of the reason he got that contract to build the Capitol, to be the very first architect of the Capitol, the initial design. I think it's pretty important to note that he was not George Washington's actual doctor, though. George Washington went somewhere else for his medical care. When Washington passes away, somewhat unexpectedly, he had been in his 60s, but he was in very, very good health. So it was a bit of a shock to the nation that George Washington passes away. William Thornton goes down there. Now it's December. It's fairly cold here at the time. Goes down to Mount Vernon. He goes to what every grieving widow wants to hear. It's like, oh, you should have called me. I would have been happy to help out there. And they got, thanks, William. Really kindly and all that stuff. But he says, no, it's not too late. Now, meanwhile, George has been laid out. It's cold. His body is frozen. George has been laid out. William Thornton comes like, it's not too late. What I need you to do is thaw the body out. Get me 8 pints of warm lamb's blood. We're going to inject it into the general's veins, and that'll get him back going right away. So keep that in mind when they say he wasn't really a very good architect, he was much better doctor. That's his quality medical care. And I'm not telling tales out of school. He bragged about this in his memoirs. So what else we do? Poor William. He'll pass away. He will be buried here at Congressional Cemetery, one of a couple of architects of the Capitol that we have here at the cemetery as well. And he designed the cenotaph that we're seeing here. Now this cenotaph was in use until I think 1874, I believe, was the last one that was ever used. Again, traditions had changed. People now expected to go back home. They weren't just buried here in Washington, D.C. when they passed away. And also, this was considered somewhat outdated, its design. In fact, the senator that got rid of the cenotaphs was a guy named Senator Hoare, H-O-A-R, from Massachusetts. And the senator from Massachusetts said, you know, being buried underneath one of these gives a new fear of death. They were gaudy at the time and all that stuff. Now, I've seen Senator Hoare's tombstone up in Concord, Massachusetts, and it's a simple, boring thing of marble, so he has no real room to talk, but nevertheless, that was the idea. We're not going to walk all the way up there, but if you look just directly behind you over here, the rather ornate one over there is Elridge Gerry, or Geary, really, as he pronounced it. Elridge was the governor of Massachusetts, the only sign of the Declaration of Independence here in Washington, D.C. The only vice president still buried here in Washington, D.C. He was vice president under Madison. We used to have another one that was buried just a few feet away, George Clinton, but he went back to New York years ago. But Gerry, or Geary is best known for gerrymandering. When he was governor of Massachusetts, he redistricted an area. The district looked like a salamander, so Geary, gerrymander, salamander, all put together. So the term gerrymandering. In fact, we joked the last ward redistricting here in Washington, D.C., they actually gerrymandered Jerry's grave when they redid the ward boundaries. So we are in Ward 6 by about a couple hundred feet over there. The jail, the DC jail, that's Ward 7. So they actually carved out the cemetery a little bit. It was quite the thing. So Elridge Gerry had the privilege of actually being gerrymandered in more recent times. Come over this way a little bit. One of our best known grave sites here is Chief Pushmataha. I'm going to swing around a little bit here. Pushmataha is just an absolute fascinating character and really captures a lot of the nuance that went into the expansion of the American Southeast from Georgia, Alabama, and all that. He was a Choctaw. You can see the more modern tombstone, which if you see the old cenotaph, kind of echoes that. That was built fairly recently, and it was created by members of the Choctaw Nation that are currently in the state of Oklahoma. You can see it's still obviously revered as a Choctaw by the Choctaws there. We fall into very simple narratives about Andrew Jackson, about the Native Americans at the time and all that stuff. But in the War of 1812, Pushmataha and Andrew Jackson fought together. They were, for all that the well-deserved dislike of Andrew Jackson as the Trail of Tears and his treatment of Native Americans, he made common cause with them when fighting the British in 1812. Pushmataha was made a U.S. Army officer. If you look down here very closely, you can see that marker right over here underneath his grave. That is a marker done by the Veterans Administration, by the Department of Veteran Affairs, to notify which of the graves are former U.S. military members that they are responsible for coming through and maintaining, taking care of, so that Pushmataha has that honor and recognition of his service with the U.S. Army during the War of 1812. And he quite reasonably thought that, hey, I fought with the Americans, I fought as an American during the War of 1812, when these folks from Georgia, these settlers, are pushing out west being Alabama, Mississippi time period at the time, that surely the U.S. government will protect my tribe and my folks' land here. Obviously, the U.S. government was not as keen to protect the Native Americans at the time, so he goes, no problem. I'm going to go to Washington, D.C. I'm going to talk to my good buddy Andrew Jackson. We're all wartime friends from each other. We'll take care of this. And as history records, Andrew Jackson was not really helping him out a whole lot. Chief Pushmataha passes away here in Washington, D.C. at the croup of respiratory infection, and he will be buried here in Washington, D.C. in a military funeral. He asks that the dead guns fire over him one more time. So they bring cannon from the Navy Yard, they fire off a salute to him as he has passed away. Come on this way a little bit here. We're going to cut through the cenotaphs a little bit. Kind of a good spot to talk about the stone and how we use the stone for the day. So we'll wander over this way a little bit more here. And we come here to William Swinton. William Swinton is our first and oldest resident of the cemetery. He was a stone carver himself at the U.S. Capitol. I believe he died of a fall. He died on the job at the Capitol, building the new Capitol. As you can see here, he's from Scotland. He was one of those European stone carvers that was brought over to do some to help construct this new capital city here. And this is almost certainly the same sandstone that was used to build the early Capitol and the White House. Aquia Creek sandstone. If you go down the river a little bit, down the Potomac River, you come across Aquia, Virginia. It's a sandstone quarry just outside the river that was just outside the Washington, D.C. A little bit or so. And you hear a lot of stories about why the White House, why the Capitol was painted white, because the British burned it in 1814 and so on. Not so much, is because if you leave sandstone to weather, this is what it's going to look like. If you leave that particular sandstone. So this is Aquia Creek sandstone left out for 13 years. I'm going to do the math now, not math guy. So this is 1807, very first person to be buried over here. And you can see from the sandstone how well it holds the cut. Some of these cuts are very well done here. There's been a few chunks missing here or there, a couple little pitting things here or there, but in terms of keeping the grooves, keeping the alignment, it does a very, very good job. Now marble, you see marble statues, the David, the Michelangelo David and so on. It looks beautiful when it's freshly carved. It holds that very nicely. The problem with marble though, is you can see my little lamb over here. If you look over to your left a little bit, you can see the lamb, which I'm sure at one point was very nicely carved and very freshly carved, has kind of faded away. You have this, this kind of rough, it's called sugaring, where the weather exposes it and all that type of stuff. So it doesn't do well with outdoor stuff for a long time. But then you also have granite moving across over here. Let's swing around a little bit. You see the granite. This is 1914, so over 100 years old. Still shiny as the day it came off the line. Holds its edge very, very well. Looks beautiful. See them. Great stone to use. Of course, the problem with granite here is that it's very, very hard and difficult to do. So until you had steam tools, until you had more power tools to carve this, it was very difficult. In fact, very rare to work with when you for hand tools. Come this way a little bit here.
Tim, do you have the other earbud? Okay, put it in. That's the mic. There you go. I think so.
Adopted grave folks working over that way here, but I want to talk about J. Edgar Hoover, who really needs no real introduction, but he gets one anyway. And Hoover is here simply because this was his family plot. You can see his father's grave over there as well. His father was a functionary, a bureaucrat with the U.S. government. Worked for the U.S. Geological Survey, if I remember correctly, something along those lines. His mother, his sister, and of course J. Edgar all the way at the bottom over that way. This fence is a more recent addition. After he passed away, agents from the FBI had this fence built, and this used to be a place where they would come here. They would sit on this bench. They would commune with them. J. Edgar Hoover is another of these very complex, difficult characters to really like. I certainly don't like them all, but we talk about him a lot today. You talk about him in connection with civil rights movement, Dr. King, the rather despicable letter he sent encouraging Dr. King to commit suicide. We talk about him with the communists, with the crackdown on political dissidents, with homosexuality, with blackmailing and intimidating gay folks, things like that. So there's a lot in the negative column, and I'm not going to gloss over any of that. But we also remember where he came from and how he came to be in charge of the FBI and what he did to create a professional Federal Bureau of Investigation. He grew up on Capitol Hill. If you go to the United Methodist Church in Seward Square, that was the site of his family home. He actually belonged to that church and helped sell his family home to the church when they rebuilt it. He grew up here. He attended George Washington University, which has better graduates, I promise you. He goes to, he works at Eastern Market. If you're familiar with Eastern Market, he was known as Speedo. He was a very young, very energetic, very go-getter kind of kid at the time. Goes to law school. Doesn't have a whole lot of close personal relationships. It's kind of an interesting character there. Doesn't make a lot of friends. He belongs to fraternity, but he doesn't fit our kind of modern perception of a frat guy with a lot of guys, things like that. Starts working at the Library of Congress, and this is an interesting, a very formative job for him as a young man working at the Library of Congress, where he learns about communicating, controlling, and cataloging data, about how to take large amounts of data and store it, and how to access it and to use the data. He becomes a lawyer, gets to go to GW Law School. And he comes in right after the Teapot Dome scandal, which is a kind of forgotten scandal, but would have caused kind of the end of the Harding administration if Harding hadn't conveniently died ahead of time to get that out of the way. He ends up passing away. Sorry, not passing away. He ends up coming in to help clean house at the Department of Justice, the old Bureau of Investigation. And when he does so, he takes some of these techniques he learns over at the Library of Congress about cataloging data, about how to synthesize data, how to create a national law enforcement agency. And I think it's important to remember that law enforcement in the U.S., traditionally as well as today, is not national. It is local in scope. You have local police officers, you have state, you have all kinds of things. The Secret Service predates the FBI a little bit, but its function is very narrowly defined for protecting currency, protecting the president and other dignitaries. So the FBI is the first one to create this national police agency, which is what we need at this point because we have technology that's getting in the way of local law enforcement. So beforehand, even with the railroad, if you commit a crime, if you rob a bank in Topeka and you want to get to Chicago, you got to go to the train station, you got to wait. It's very easy for the sheriff to come down there and arrest you for that. But with the automobile, you can get in that car and you can drive 300 miles in a day and be out of town in just a very quick amount of time. So these law enforcement agencies have no format to talk to each other, to coordinate. And this is what the Bureau of Investigation does. He's enamored of the new technology of fingerprinting, of using that as a way to identify people, to communicate them. He uses that a lot of that. So it's kind of important to remember all that stuff. Now, also with that data, what he's also doing at this time is he is accumulating records of every political figure in Washington, D.C. He is blackmailing them. He is bringing in all kinds of things. He is blackmailing folks in Hollywood. Otherwise, he's creating a vast personal trove of data, too, to use to keep his own power. So he'll stay in power from the 1920s all the way until he passes away in the 1970s. That data, those personal records that he kept of dignitaries, probably, fortunately for the good of the nation, was destroyed by his secretary upon his death, because Nixon was president at the time, and God help us all if Nixon got hold of it. As a historian, it's kind of a pity because it would be great to be able to see the personal lives of some of these figures from the 1920s to the 1970s, but practically speaking, that would have been a bad thing at the time. We're going to come over this way a little bit, talk more about Hoover as we go down the road. Good. And I'm going to take a break from Hoover and talk about another person that's buried over in this section over here. And I'm not going to talk about him too much until we have a chance to see his tombstone. So let's see that grave right over here, and then we're going to talk about some of the meaning of it. Come right over here to the corner, underneath this tree. Just take a moment to read what it says here, for those that can see that on the camera here. The date's born, never again, never forget. A gay Vietnam veteran. When I was in the military, they gave me a medal for killing 2 men and a discharge for loving 1. And this is, as you can read it, a defiant, a very proud, very out tombstone here. It doesn't really have a name on it. Down here at the bottom we'll mention Matt Levitch here, but that is secondary to the statement that's being made here. Let's talk about the gentleman that's buried here, the gentleman named Leonard Matlovich, why this exists and what the importance of this here is. Leonard Matlovich grows up, he's a military brat himself, grows up all over the world. He's born down in Georgia. And he grows up kind of in culture that the things of the time, both on race and with sexuality. He is gay. Now, it takes him a while to come around to that conclusion. In his biography, some of the things he talks about in his life, he says around 12, 13 years old, as a young man, he starts having these feelings. He denies them to himself. He doesn't want to be gay. He tries to to consider himself not gay. He attempts to have relations with women, but obviously doesn't go very well. He joins the Air Force, partly because of his family upbringing, but also because the military does not allow gay people in there. And if I join the military, then ergo I cannot be gay, which is kind of the thought process he goes through there. While in the military, he'll do 3 tours in Vietnam. He'll receive a Purple Heart. He steps on a mine in Da Nang. He also, you can see, he got a Bronze Star for actions where he ended up killing 2 Viet Cong. Quite decorated. And he also comes to grips with the racial part of his background. Growing up a white man, generally in the South, generally in the military, and the Air Force is the first place where he interacts with African Americans on a professional level. He has a African American CO, and he starts realizing some of the cultural, the racist upbringings he had were wrong. And he's got to a period of we got a lot of we're still maintaining the cemetery, things are doing well, so a little noise. The bane of tour guides everywhere, long term. But he goes getting some of these racial attitudes, and as he does so, he's like, oh, this is wrong. This is not right. He has a lot of deep soul searching, and coupled with that, he's like, I'm also living a lie in terms of my sexuality, in terms of who I am. And as he does so, he starts interacting with more of the homosexual kind of social scene that goes on at the time. A lot of underground, a lot of the it's obviously illegal to be homosexual in the first place. Illegal to be gay and be in the military. Well, wait one more time here. Another pause in front of one by. Yeah. So he's living this dual life. He also falls into a company. He gets to know a gentleman, Frank Kameny, who has a marker just over that way. He passed away a little more recently. Frank Kameny is another fascinating, just in the 1950s, in what was called the Lavender Scare. It was part of the Red Scare, part of this McCarthyism, part of what J. Edgar Hoover was involved in, of driving out homosexuals in the government. Frank Kameny says, you know what, this is not right. And as a reaction to that, starts some of the very early LGBT movements, the Macchiat Society, which I'm mispronouncing, I apologize, and all this formal folks saying we're not that. So Frank goes with, has been looking to do someone to go in the military and say, I'm gay and I want to serve. They team up together, and Leonard goes to his CO, drops a letter on his desk and says, you know what, I'm a decorated war veteran, also I'm gay and I want to remain in the Air Force. Which is a problem for the Air Force, because the Air Force wants to keep them in. They go through some their paperwork and say, you know what, it's okay. As long as you promise not to be gay anymore, or at least not have actual homosexual interactions anymore, we'll keep you in. Which is what often happened with people that were valued, but they didn't want to have to deal with it. And basically just keep it quiet, just a informal do not ask, don't tell, if you will, at the time. And Leonard says, no, absolutely not. I'm here. I want to be, formally in the Air Force. I'm not looking to get out. I'm not looking for a free ride or anything like that. But also this is who I am, and I want you to know that. So the Air Force begins the process of discharging him. They discharge him with a general discharge, which is a level under an honorable discharge. And this gives Leonard, as well as Frank Kameny and others, the vehicle to sue the U.S. Air Force, to sue the government based on his level of discharge, which they end up winning. Now it's overturned on well, that's not overturned. It's the Air Force addresses the technical legal issues, and it wouldn't be until the 2000s that gay folks are formally allowed to serve. But it's this kind of pivotal moment of Leonard Mallory. She's on the cover of Time magazine in 1975. The first time an openly gay person's on the cover of a national news magazine. So he becomes quite a hero of that. Now he goes on, he takes the settlement, he gets in the Air Force, he opens a pizzeria out in California. He will end up passing away of AIDS in 1988. And when he passes away, he had lived in the neighborhood somewhat. When he had first been diagnosed with AIDS, he had sold his pizzeria. He had gone to France and gone to Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, and he'd seen the graves of Oscar Wilde, of Gertrude Stein, and her companion, and seen that kind of thing. And it's like, you know what, I can make that same kind of similar statement with my grave. And so he asked to be buried here. He knows the Air Force will not allow him to be buried in Arlington. Because Congressional as a kind of good substitute, and he gets buried here. He used to walk around here in the neighborhood. He had been a lover of history and grave sites before that, when he lived nearby, and that's hence this marker is designed to be a memorial to more than just his own life, but to the larger issues that he's trying to highlight there as well, which is why you have that. Now, going back just a little bit, we talked about J. Edgar Hoover and his prosecution of homosexuals, his prosecution of folks like Frank Hanley and other ones like that, which is interesting because there's a lot of discussion of J. Edgar Hoover's personal life. Oh, hands up. That was timed well. That's better than the lawnmowers, at least. So you just got to see the Blue Angels and Thunderbirds, the Navy and the Air Force's demonstration team flying over, and Air Force Mention right here. So that was particularly well timed to see it there. So of course we planned it that way. Anyway, we're going to wrap this up in just a couple minutes here. I want to point out just a little bit where we are at the cemetery here. We've just gotten through this one section right here. We've stayed entirely in this section that goes from the gatehouse to the chapel. It has some of the original entrances over this way. This was the historic cemetery. This is where it existed for the good part of its early existence. Since then it's expanded out. We talked about John Philip Sousa way in the other end. There's Marion Barry is down this way a little bit here. There's a whole other section all the way down there that we never make it on tours. So there's a lot more to explore here. So I hope you'll come back to join us here on other tours. We're going to do these weekly tours. We're going to have other docents that maybe explore other parts of the cemetery that we don't see as much, or maybe they'll tell the same stories I did, but with different facts and stuff like that. So different stories about that. So there's a lot more to see here. I hope you can join us here in the next couple weeks.